Hey everyone, welcome back. David, History for the Ages here. So, those of you who follow my channel know I cover a lot of history of the Middle East. I have a whole playlist on the history of Israel. I've been teaching the history of the Middle East for 25 years. And one, of course, really important topic is the impact of women. I cover this in my courses, and it really is a tale of two worlds when you compare the rights of women in Israel versus the Arab world. And please leave your comments and thoughts on this video. I think this is an important topic that too many people are not aware of, and very often, and when you see a lot of kind of the women's rights movement in the US, and there's kind of this weird dichotomy where so many of them seem to want to ignore the stark difference in the Arab world. They kind of stay more silent about that stuff in the Arab world and the problems there. And obviously, that's not healthy if you support women's rights, right? So let's get going on some of the stuff here. And one of the core issues is voting rights. And historically, women, if you think about it in Israel, were able to vote from the very foundation of the nation, right? So 1948, Israel was recognized as an independent nation, and immediately women were able to vote. Not only were women able to vote, you actually have very early, within a couple decades basically, the first prime minister of England who is a woman. Of course, Golda Meir. A lot of people know about her. And, in U.S. history, we still haven't had a woman president, but of course, in Israel, they had a female prime minister a few decades into their existence. The Knesset, or parliament in Israel, is very, much represented more for women than other Arab nations. And you look at the numbers here, I put some numbers, and basically, since about 1948, on the average, it's about 15 to 20%. Today, it's obviously higher. And you go, well, then, that doesn't seem too high, right? If women are about 50% of the population, shouldn't be higher, but you have to also compare it to other nations. And so, just for example, the US Senate on the average has been about 5 to 10% since 1948. And so, when you compare apples to apples, the percentage is quite stark. Women in Israel have very much big voting rights, political rights in Israel, and are very much involved in politics. Now, when you compare this to the Arab nations, I mean, folks, Saudi Arabia, women weren't even allowed to vote until 2015. And in terms of serving in their parliaments and their governments, and of course, obviously a lot of the other governments in the Middle East aren't even democracies, right? Really, none of them are really a pure sense of democracy the way Israel is. It's about 5% on the average. It is a little bit higher today than the total average, of course, but if we're comparing 1948 till today, it's about 5%. And so many women in the Arab nations simply do not have a lot of voting rights. Even when they are allowed to vote, it's very kind of controlled. And in terms of serving in their various parliaments, it is also greatly limited. And this is kind of a good little map that shows when each country got voting rights. Obviously, see, Turkey's a little bit earlier because Turkey, of course, had the whole story of Mustafa Kemal. If you're familiar with that, in my History of Middle East courses, I cover that. And he took a more secular approach when Turkey was created, and that was part of the changes there, while a lot of the other Middle Eastern Arab nations, of course, didn't absorb that philosophy. All right, let's go on to education and workforce participation. So this is a really cool image, and he sees here women in Israel not just free but equal. And in many respects, in some areas, like in education, women actually make up the majority of the kids in college today. That's actually true in the United States as well, I believe. But here's just a list of some of the very well-known women in Israel. There's others as well, not on this list. There's a biotech chemist professor, Ada Yonath, and she was the first Israeli woman to win a Nobel Prize in I believe it was chemistry, I believe, but I could be wrong on that. I apologize for that. And it was like one of the first women to win a Nobel Prize in that category. Period. You see this one journalist there. I think interesting to note about her. Yes, she's Israeli, but she's also Arab. And a lot of people aren't familiar with this topic as well, that within Israel, there are over a million, almost a couple million Arabs who live inside of Israel. And, I tell this to my students, where do Arab women have the most rights in the Arab world? in Israel, right? That's true in Arabs in general, right? If you're an Arab living in any other Middle Eastern country compared to Israel, in Israel, if you're an Arab, you have voting rights, you have legal rights, you have a lot of rights that you do not have if you're living in Iran or Saudi Arabia or Iraq or Syria or Lebanon or any of these other, and I say Arab slash Middle Eastern nations because I know like Iran technically is not an Arab nation, but still part of the Middle East. So anyway, so there's a lot of people there, and of course there's a couple more pretty famous women that come out of Israel. Dr. Ruth, right? It's kind of a funny little story. A lot of people are surprised with this. So Dr. Ruth, yes, that Dr. Ruth, who of course gives all the sex education advice and everything. She's not really technically, well, she because she was part of Israel before pre-state. She actually don't people don't know this. She was a sniper. She was in the Haganah, which was part of the group that was trying to kind of help establish the state of Israel, and they were having enemies. And so little Dr. Ruth served as a sniper. I always thought that was a crazy little story. And of course, you can't talk about Israeli women without Gal Gadot. So she's of course just a very well known figure for her amazing talents in acting and so forth. And so, as I said, women are very involved in education. About 60% of women in college in Israel, of the students in college in Israel, are women. Now, how do you compare that to the Arab world? Well, again, education and workplace for other Middle Eastern nations, it depends where you are, right? Obviously, you go somewhere like Afghanistan when they were controlled by the Taliban. I mean, you're banned from going to school. You don't get really any education. There's a really powerful book called A Thousand Splendid Suns. I use it in my History of the Middle East class. If you've never read that book, read that book. Um, but in some Arab nations, things are improving a little bit. But even in the kind of the high point, maybe 40% of the people who attend colleges are women. And even if you are a highly educated woman in many of these Middle Eastern nations outside of Israel, it's hard to get jobs. A lot of these countries, you actually have to obtain a male guardianship permission to work. Obviously, that doesn't happen in Israel, but in Arab nations, that's something that sometimes you need. We also have to look at other points: legal rights, personal freedoms, right? So if you're an Israeli woman, you have protections in marriage, divorce, child custody. There are, of course, some religious courts in Israel. There is this kind of Orthodox community there. But even in that community, there are processes and rights to protect women, even in the most orthodox of religious communities in Israel. In Arab nations, there's very limited personal freedoms. Obviously, you think of dress codes, right? It is legal. You have to wear a hijab. You can't and loose-fitting clothing. There's a story. This was like from the time I'm recording this. I want to say like half a year ago, and didn't get much press. But there's this woman in Iran, and she decided to take off her hijab, and of course, she was chastised for it, and then she decided as a form of protest to basically remove pretty much most of her clothing other than her short pants and a bra. And she was found, she was taken. This kind of little political cartoon here because she had tremendous courage to stand up to this oppression in Iran that you see of women there. And there's sadly many of these stories there. And so this is something that you often see in many Middle Eastern nations where they simply don't have the most basic freedoms to even wear what they want to wear compared to what you would see in Israel. And of course, there are a few other topics we can talk about. One of the things about laws, marriage laws, of course, is in Arab countries, it's very favorable to men, all the laws, custody laws, prioritize the father, women can't even initiate divorces. And there's another topic, two more things I just want to mention here: honor killings. This is a really serious thing that a lot of people are not familiar with, but in some Arab nations, Middle Eastern Muslim nations, that if a woman is raped, it is considered quote unquote okay or quote unquote honorable if she's killed. And it sounds so horrific, but it is something that does happen. Is this like all the time in Arab nations? No, but it does. And I could probably do a whole other lecture on this, but the treatment of the LGBT community. And I'm mentioning this because I think this is one of the most stunning things I sometimes see in colleges, where I see folks who are part of the LGBT community and they're anti-Israel. And I just kind of sit there and I'm thinking to myself, really? You literally go to Israel, and this is kind of image of a flag that they have gay pride parades, and there are people with flags with Israel, with the rainbow flag representing the LGBT community. Um, you are an LBGT person in many Arab nations. You go into Gaza or West Bank or Saudi Arabia or Iran, you'll be lucky if you're alive if you come out openly, in that way of life. So I just think that's another important point that people aren't aware of and probably should be aware of when you're kind of looking at the moral comparison between these two nations. So anyways, this is something I just put together. I hope you found that interesting, informative, and feel free to share, leave comments. And again, I have a ton of other content on the history of the Middle East, history of Israel that you can watch on my channel. Leave a couple links here you can look at. And other than that, everyone have a great day. Thank you for watching.